Okay, to the East Asia region we go. Looking first here at the map, you see it includes lesser known countries that we don't often hear about, such as Mongolia and Taiwan, as well as, of course, we hear a lot in the news lately about China, North Korea, and in particular South Korea with the Olympics this spring. Japan always a mainstay on the global news networks. We can begin to see a lot from these climatic zones, how this influences architecture and human movements through time and space. The map also showing the intertropical convergence zone, its northern limit, ranging from southern China, northern India, northern Burma, or Myanmar. One thing to keep in mind is the prominence of natural hazards in this region. Of course, Mount Fuji here in Japan, exemplifying a very significant natural hazard, but also typhoons or extremely strong hurricanes in the western Pacific Ocean, tropical cyclones. Japan's location makes it very vulnerable to volcanic eruptions, earthquakes, tsunamis, especially the heavily populated zone from Tokyo southwest through the inland sea is particularly vulnerable. Environmental issues in general, climate change, of course, especially global warming, is a growing concern in East Asia. China is now the world's largest overall producer of greenhouse gases, but still produces less than 1/3 of US emissions on a per capita basis. Japan is also a major emitter, and China's greenhouse gas emissions make up almost 1/4 of the world's total. Will possibly double by 2030 as urban households use more cars, air conditioning, appliances, and computers. So very significant changes on the horizon. Looking at vulnerability to climate change here, northern China again, throughout western China, northwestern China, and Xinjiang province, with extreme vulnerability there. Even around Beijing with water scarcity, vulnerability to climate change is very high. North Korea as well. So air pollution, choking on success, as we can think of it, often more severe in East Asia, but air quality in China's cities is particularly poor. Coal burning is the primary source of pollution. China's world is the world's largest consumer and producer of coal. 46% of all coal burned on the planet each year. Staggering amount. The worst pollution is often in the cities, homes, or close proximity to industries. And the use of coal to heat homes can be detrimental to people's health. When I was living in China, it was quite surprising still to see coal burned openly on the streets for charcoal, for cooking, and in rural areas for warmth in the homes. Sulfur dioxide from coal burning contributes to acid rain, and this affects other nations as the wind takes that elsewhere. Air pollution from vehicles is severe. The use of cars for personal transportation in China is just beginning and taking off at staggering speeds. Here we have an air quality index map. You can see some of the different regional differences across China. More of the red, unhealthy, predominantly in the eastern cities. PM10 stands for particulate matter of 10 microns, a very small amount, a very small size. Is detrimental because it gets lodged in the lungs even deeper. Air pollution beyond China, public health risks related to air pollution are also serious in the largest cities of Japan. Taiwan has some of the dirtiest air in the world, very high density in cities. North Korea, relatively few industries and very few cars. So air pollution levels are thought to be low, although there's very few reliable data are available. And South Korea uses fossil fuels in numerous industries and has many gasoline powered cars. So this is by no means just an issue in China. And in all fairness, China has done a lot, some of the most advances in the world as far as adapting and adopting, implementing sustainable fuel choices especially for electric generation, largest solar powered energy capacity in the world. Also on that note, globalization and development, East Asia's role as a mega financer is very important to consider in this region. Chinese economy remained robust after the recession, largely because of domestic purchasing power and consumption increased and diminished the dependence on shaky Western economies. By 2012, foreign banks owned 35% of US public debt, and 35% of that was owned by Japanese and Chinese banks. The China and Japan lent money partly to ensure that consumers in the US would continue to buy their goods, so to keep the economy afloat. In recent years, China's lending to developing countries has outpaced even that of the World Bank. So very significant loans are often made in return for guarantees that the recipient country will supply China with needed industrial materials, in particular fossil fuels. Here are some of the major holders of US Treasury securities in billions of US dollars. You can see how significant China and Japan are on this spectrum. For the power and politics section here, we can look at the Chinese Communist Party officially claims China is a democracy. However, some elections have long been held at the village level and within the Communist Party. But representatives to the National People's Congress are appointed by the Communist Party elite, who maintain a tight control throughout all levels of government. As well, informed consumers and environmentalists in developed countries have long criticized China for the quote-unquote no-holds-barred pursuit of economic growth. And the 2008 Olympics in Beijing highlighted issues that created the impetus for increasing democracy, as far as international media spotlight on human rights abuses of workers, protesters, prisoners, and as well ethnic minorities such as the Tibetans and the Uyghurs and spiritual groups. Lots of human rights groups pointing out injustices in all of these categories. Here we see a map throughout the region that we've seen similar to other regions as far as conflicts, armed conflicts, genocides with high death tolls since 1945. See in China multiple one of the 30 million deaths. That would be the Great Leap Forward of 1959 to 1961. Massive human-caused famine and starvation, as well as the Cultural Revolution that proceeded after that with staggering amounts of deaths. North Korea as well, probably indicating the North Korean War there. The Korean War mainly taking place in North Korea and along the border of South Korea. Information technology and political reform. Internet in China is not an open forum that it is in most Western countries. Starting in 2003, Chinese internet users were required to register actual names when using an online account. It's an attempt by the government to monitor free speech and anonymous criticisms against the Communist Party officials. And the Great Firewall, as it's known, is aided by US technology firms Yahoo and Microsoft, which allow the government to use software that blocks access to certain websites. So it's challenging. It's not impossible, but without ways of breaking through the firewall, it's forbidden to use Facebook, for instance, in China. Google is in a dispute with the Chinese government over state-sponsored censorship, invasion of human rights, activist email accounts, cyber attacks. Therefore, it's moved its operations to Hong Kong, where more freedom is allowed. Protest and political freedom, very important to look at within East Asia. People are increasingly joining interest groups that pressure government to take action on particular problems, such as land expropriation, the taking away of peasants' and farmers' lands by the government or rich tycoons. Internet has emerged as a critical tool for collective action, and in efforts to maintain control over China's protesters, the government has allowed elections to be held for urban resident committees. Seems to provide a peaceful outlet for voicing frustrations and creating limited change at the local level. So contrary to what we hear sometimes in the West, there are citizen movements in China, in North Korea, in Mongolia, although sometimes these are met with harsh reprimand from the government. Urbanization, a critical part of the world to look at urbanization, massive amounts of urbanization, especially since the 1980s in recent decades. China has undergone the most massive urbanization in the world in all of history. Since 1980, urban population has more than tripled, now nearly 700 million. So over half of the population of China is now urban. Despite rapid growth, urbanites represent merely 51% of the total population, so more growth is likely. And this is in fact what we're seeing. That 51% stat is about 5 years old now. In every country in the region, the majority of the population, let me scroll down here a little bit for you, has been urban for at least 2 decades. So that's very significant. Shanghai's latest reforms, urban landscape has been remade by the construction of more than 1,000 businesses and residential skyscrapers. The prominent building here is nicknamed the Bottle Opener for its obvious reasons. Stunning skyscrapers in Shanghai if you ever get a chance to go there. Suburban development linked to Shanghai's economic boom is unfortunately though gobbling up farmland and displacing farmers. Displaced farmers have rioted even. The Pudong, the new financial center for the city, sits across the Huangpu River from what's known as the Bund, the Shanghai's famous elegant row of big brownstone buildings that served as the financial capital of China until half a century ago. There were many foreign banks before the Communist Revolution there. The foreign architecture just across the river from this picture is very evident, but now they're all Chinese banks flying Chinese flags. And so responding to an aging population, low birth rates, fewer young people are being added to population, improved living conditions. People are living much longer in East Asia. Mongolia, South Korea, North Korea, and Taiwan will be several decades before the financial and social cost of supporting the numerous elderly people will have to be addressed. However, already China faces a serious problems with elder care because of the one-child policy, which has now been laxed, but urbanization as well has drastically reduced family kin groups. Japan has a very large elderly population that requires support and reduced number of young people to do the job. Robots are being used there more and more. Here we see China in 2012 versus the projected demographics of 2050. You can see what that bulging lower part of the pyramid in 2012, how that gets bulged upward into more elderly cohorts of 2050. This is a significant problem for social planners in China, one that they're scrambling to address with more programs to support the elder in years to come. And the cultural diversity is enormous of East Asia. This map doesn't do justice to these are only the major groups, but China has 55 ethnic minorities besides the Han, and there's about 117 million people in more than 55 ethnic groups, 55 official ethnic minorities besides the Han majority. And as we can see, these span into other countries as well. The Thai and Ainu people, of hill tribe peoples of southwestern China, spanning into Burma, Thailand, Laos, as well as the Duong people on the Vietnam border, Mongolians obviously on both sides of the border, Kazakhs in western China, Tibetans ranging down in Nepal and India as well. So very, very diverse ethnicities, the Koreans as well in eastern China. There's ethnic diversity in Taiwan, and Japan still has indigenous groups. So we sum that up here talking about Yunnan province. There's over 20 of the groups of the ethnic minorities living in the remote mountains that stretch, as I mentioned, into Southeast Asia. Many different languages, cultural and linguistic connections, even as far south as Cambodia, Taiwan, and adjacent islands. The Han people account for 95% of the populations, but it's home to 60 indigenous minorities. And the Han are not homogenous in Taiwan. They're divided into subgroups based on their ancestral homes in mainland China. They fled during the establishment of the People's Republic of China in 1949. And lastly, the Ainu of Japan. Several indigenous minorities in Japan. Most have suffered considerable discrimination. Ainu are characterized by their light skin, heavy beards, and thick wavy hair, as we see here. It's about 30 to 50,000. They're racially and culturally distinct group, thought to have migrated thousands of years ago from the northern Asian steppes. In 2008, the Japanese parliament officially recognized the Ainu as an indigenous minority. So it's important to keep in mind the ethnic diversity. It's something that was a large passion of mine as well, studying with the different ethnic minority groups of southwestern China and western China with Tibetans. Fascinating region of the world to look at how these different geographic themes combine and intersect. So that does it for this mini lecture, and I look forward to your questions and our discussions below. Please post. Thanks.